Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Daniel Rosenthal. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Chichester Festival Theatre for this evening's talk with Jonathan Church, director of Peter Shaffer's Amadeus on this stage. It's traditional at occasions like this to break the ice with a show of hands, and in this instance, I thought it would be very interesting to ask you how many of you saw, whether at the National Theatre or in the West End, the original 1979 production of Amadeus? Oh. Quite a few. And how many of you saw the film version? Also quite a few. And how many of you have been already to the previews of Jonathan's production? Not so many. Okay, well, we may not be able to prevent spoiler alerts for the plot in our conversation, but we'll try not to talk in too much detail for those of you coming this evening or coming later in the run. So, Jonathan, that question of first contact with the play, I know from the article in the programme that Simon Higlett had seen it at the Olivier. What was your first contact?
My first contact was, and it's a production I believe had a little time here. Keith Michel did a production on tour, and I can't remember, it must have been the late 70s, early 80s, and it was on tour, and I think I saw it in Nottingham. So I saw the play, I think quite close to seeing the film. And I just remember it being, I knew very little about Mozart. I'd done a couple of, his little pieces while learning the piano, and that was it. And so to discover, and I know a lot of it's fiction, but just how short a life he'd had, and how much music he'd written, and how extraordinary that music is. I mean, a lot of people credit Shaffer, although the play doesn't necessarily represent Mozart in a way that everybody would like to see him. A lot of people credit Shaffer with bringing Mozart into the focus of the public again.
Certainly Peter Hall does. He says that Schaffer's done as much for anybody as anybody for Mozart's reputation in the whole of the century. So in that intervening period, I'm curious as to what then becomes the impetus for reviving it. Is it the impetus to revive it, or is it finding your Salieri?
A combination of things. The impetus to revive it was started, and it's been a long journey. As I arrived here, the big issue is always what sort of work do you program on this main stage? Not every playwright writes plays that sing in this huge auditorium. And of course, Royal Hunt of the Sun and Black Comedy were premiered here in the Old Vic, and Shaffer writes for large stages. So I'd been interested in Amadeus for a while. The rights had been very hard to get hold of. There's always a wonderful practical thing, we'll say to a writer or his agent, can we do your play? And they'll go, no, because somebody else has got the rights, and the rights were held. So this is where, there's always good fortune in these things. The rights were held by actually somebody I know very well, with a director I know very well, and they couldn't cast their Salieri. They were hoping to do a West End production, and over 2 or 3 years where they'd held the rights, they hadn't been able to do it. And then 2 things occurred. We had our 50th anniversary, and we held a gala to celebrate our 50th anniversary. We invited, there aren't very many left alive, the artists who were involved in Olivier's season. And several actors, I think 5 or 6 of Olivier's original company, including Derek Jacobi, who was performing that night, were here for the gala. The surprise was that unannounced, Peter Shaffer came. We'd invited him, he'd not come. So he turned up, was reacquainted with this theatre. And so we began a conversation about what we might do. And of course, that made the link of, well, we're reopening our building. He was there virtually, one of the last performances of the old building. We went, well, isn't there a lovely link there? And similarly, we talked about who would play Salieri, because of course that's the issue. We were involved in the production of The Judas Kiss, which Rupert Everett did, and I think the thing that the rights were leaving the other producer, and the thing that clinched us getting the rights, because several people were chasing it, was we took Peter to see Rupert Everett in The Judas Kiss, and he came out of it, had coffee with Rupert, and went, this is my Salieri. So there's a great, a series of bits of good fortune. But yeah, the impetus was started by, how do I find a great play to open our new building.
When you approach a revival like this of what we might, I think, call a modern classic, 1979 to now, the extent to which, for director and or the leading actor, that original production can be a shadow. Ian McKellen, when he was taking over from Paul Scofield, the original Salieri, for Broadway, he said, I went to the Olivier Theatre and I watched it like this, you know, poking my eyes through my fingers because I knew that I couldn't be Paul Scofield. So how does that, if shadow is the wrong word, how does that apply here?
I think the shadow's right. Funnily enough, Paul Scofield cast shadows over a lot of the plays he did because they're considered, you know, they were considered at the time definitive. Olivier did the same. I think the great thing for us is partly because there have been other productions. That moment where everybody was in the shadow of Scofield, Salieri has moved on. So David Suchet did a production, so the sort of double shadows, but 15 years ago at the Old Vic. And I think the very process of a number of people having tackled it slightly removes that shadow. Also, I know here is different. I imagine most of the audience who see this now won't have seen Scofield. And I think that, you know, that's our other hope, is particularly with Rupert playing Salieri, who is now the age, almost, you know, exactly the age Scofield was when he did it. I think he appeals to a generation of audience, you know, who probably have never seen the play. So you know, I think that does it. And I also think the great thing about doing a play here is it doesn't make it the same for the actors, but you're reinventing how a play engages with an audience anyway by doing it in a thrust space. So the other shadow that's cast is the script, of course, is often an annotation of the original production. You know, a writer tends to, and it's very apparent from this one, how Peter Hall and Paul tackled that and the creative team tackled that play, because it's written into the script. So it's choosing how much of that you...
Yes, I mean, that's something I hope we can come back to when we talk about the staging. So in the casting then, you have your Salieri, you need a chemistry, you need a rapport with the actor who then plays Mozart. So in casting Mozart and then in choosing Joshua Maguire, do you think about the Rupert Everett? Do you think about what Shaffer writes about Mozart? A small, pallid, large-eyed man, extremely restless, his voice light and high and possessed of an unforgettable giggle.
I met, as it happened, I mean, Joshua was somebody that we were very interested in doing this part. I did meet Joshua in an audition situation, partly because I think the great thing you're often looking for is just somebody's particular sympathy with the text, and it's not necessarily about a description. It's not necessarily you know, what the writer's written. Sometimes you can do a piece of casting that is the opposite of the physical description that a writer's given. As it happens, I think Joshua does tick many of those boxes. The big thing I was looking for, I mean, Shaffer uses it, Salieri uses it, Mozart is described as a creature. Now that's an unusual world, and it comes from that strange mixture of things that Mozart was, and finding somebody who could believably deliver that. The other thing I thought was important, which Josh did for me, is you have to believe, you know, madness and genius are very close, that somebody, the person you cast as Mozart, could have written that work. And that's a sort of intangible thing. And you know, Josh convinced me of that. He's, you know, phenomenally intelligent, and I hope you'll see also possessed of bags of theatrical energy. So,
did the two of them read together before he was cast?
No, I tend not to do that. But we met. We had actually, as you talked about the relationship between a Mozart and Constanza and Salieri, and this are important. And so I cast them individually, but we had a meeting where we all met and talked a bit about the play, talked about costume. So we just started that process before we got in the rehearsal room.
And either between casting and the start of rehearsal or the early phase of rehearsal, is it this an instance of we're just going to do the play and act that, or the researching of Mozart and Salieri's lives, 1780s Vienna, how much of that, if any, comes into play?
There's a bit of research. I mean, I think every actor does their own amount of research, and of course, as a director, you try and You try and do as much as helps you. Of course, ultimately rehearsals are about delivering the text, and this play in particular, because it's such a weaving of fact and fiction. It's good to know the weaving of the fact and fiction, but the fact doesn't necessarily help you because you might make other choices. So yeah, research is important. I mean, the work with the designer that you can see, Vienna and those alleyways, those coffee shops, those, imagining people of that period sitting in their salons gossiping about the next great composer. All of that was an important part of the process, and researching that and looking at it. But ultimately, we try not to wear that research on our sleeve when delivering the play. Ultimately, what you've got to do is deliver the piece and find a way of theatricalizing it for an audience.
And then similarly, in how in rehearsal you develop those central relationships, particularly Mozart and Salieri, do you talk around the general question of the envy of a less talented man for the more gifted one, which can be in any sphere of life, in any period of history? Yeah,
of course we do. I think it's not in the other great simple gift for us is this is a play about, on some level, one artist who's jealous of another. Jealousy in artists in any form is it's an easy thing for us to understand. And it's not, so of course we talk about those things. I mean, I tend to try and you talk about these things as they occur through the text. Any research, you sort of build up layers of stuff and how you relate to now. And I think that's the other thing. Whenever you redo a play, you're relating it to whatever period it's set in. You are relating to the circumstances around you. And I suspect Rupert Everett's Salieri is going to be, acting has moved on. In a period, it's going to be a different interpretation, just because his journey to where he is and Paul Schofield's were very different, and styles of acting have changed.
Have you been able to talk to Peter Shaffer about the play? Because when you're doing Arturo Ui or another revival, you can't have Brecht there to talk to, but in this instance you can.
Yeah, I did talk to Shaffer, and he gave me, as part of the research, some lovely insights. And partly on his research and what he'd found, and so he was able to tell me firsthand what he'd put into the play. I think, from what I gather, he of course fell in, like everybody falls in love with Mozart, and Salieri. I think again he was a less public figure in some ways, and less is known about him. So I think the level of invention about Salieri is greater. But with Mozart, he told me a couple of wonderful things that really helped, and that I talked to me and talked to Josh about. There's a line of text in the play about how, while playing billiards, Mozart would be composing these great arias and great symphonies. He told me something that I didn't know at that point, which was that literally Mozart could be holding a conversation as I am with you, and with his right hand still be writing. And so the music was, it goes a stage further than what's put in the play. He also talked about, and he describes Mozart as often never being still, which, but Mozart's also often described as drunk, or drunk on the cheap wine. He said, and it's not literally put in the play, he said, what I felt as I researched him and as I wrote him, that one of the things Mozart was constantly drunk on was the music. He said the music was never out of his head, and this is why he was so prolific, and that was a wonderful gift for a writer to give me in terms of them being able to say that to the actors.
Have you been listening to the music constantly yourself?
Yes, it goes round and round. In my head, there's a couple of bits of the magic flute that go round and round in my head, and I'll wake up at the moment. I'll wake up at 3 in the morning, with the Queen of the Night going round. There's also the serenade that Salieri does one of his great speeches to. Just sits and sits and sits in my head, and I'm looking forward to Saturday when I go on holiday after the press night, and I can listen to something other than Mozart.
And were you, Peter Hall, when he directed Amadeus, was, in Schaffer's words, a great Mozartian. He directed the operas at Glyndebourne. Are you coming to it much more freshly than that?
No, I'm not an opera. I've seen a number of the operas, but I'm not, I don't know my opera that well. And I didn't know, I knew about as much about Mozart as the film and the play had told me. So yes,
But having no preconceptions, with the revival, the notion that you treat the revival like a new play, and because you're directing for the audience who haven't seen it.
And also yes, I'm discovering. I'm discovering it, and that's a nice thing. Also, we have followed, not entirely but generally, what Peter Hall and Peter Shaffer did in that first production was structure. From what I gather. The music, when they started, wasn't all chosen. I think as the play was being written and being worked on, the pieces were honed down, and those choices, in a sense, because they're so woven. I mean, this is one of the extraordinary things. A couple of the speeches Salieri's does and Concerto, they're timed to the music, and that, to unpick that and start again. I mean, a braver director might. But the choices, I mean, part of why I think this production worked is that with all the great characters, of course, there is also this other, invisible character, which is Mozart's music, and you hear it, and he's all, when there's two people on the scene in Mozart's music, it's a three-handed scene. And so we've had the gift of those decisions that Peter Hall and Shaffer and composer made.
And Shaffer was very wary of it. He said, as with any play about music, you can only use a little, because otherwise, if the music's any good, it becomes a concert. And the audience sits back and thinks, isn't this marvellous? And then, oh God, they're going to start talking again. And if it's Mozart, it's that to the power of 10. So, but I am fascinated in this balance between what was done in '79 and what you're trying to do, in the fact that you're working with Matthew Scott, who in 1979 was, in his own words, a terrified student working alongside Harrison Birtwistle, who was arranging the Mozart pieces. So how has that operated?
Well, again, we have the gift of Matthew's knowledge of that original process and knowing how that structure works. And also, like any great artist, what I think Matthew's done is he's made some different choices because he, either now or then didn't necessarily agree with them. But no, I think it helped me because for him to bring, when we stepped into the rehearsal room, which I suspect Peter Hall didn't have the luxury of, we had the structure of the music and Matthew going, I think this should start there, or although the script seems to indicate this, what about? We had all of that, and his knowledge was so much ahead of anybody who could have been starting on it completely fresh. And
without giving away how in detail you've done it, there's the balance to be struck, which Shaffer and Hall and Birtwistle discuss, between it sounding recognisably like Mozart to the audience's ears who are maybe familiar with recordings or Radio 3 or the Albert Hall, and it's Salieri's version of Mozart.
Yeah, we've probably not taken as strong a line on it being Salieri's memory of that. I think we've gone, and I think Matthew has treated a lot of it, but I don't think you'd necessarily always notice. So I think for me, celebrating the extraordinary beauty of that music, and it's also one of the decisions you make because a lot of it's narrated, and it's narrated from the point of view of an old man looking back. You can make decisions about how much it's the old man looking back who's telling you and how much it's the young man in the situation. And of course, it's a balance of the two, but often in terms of telling the story for the audience, the experiencing it as if you're experiencing it within the moment as it's happening is more powerful and immediate for me than looking at it from a distance. So we've probably done less in terms of making it a memory. It is a memory piece by its definition, but I think we've tried to, when we hit it, make it appear that you're hearing that music of Mozart's for the first time as Salieri is in that moment, rather than looking at it from afar.
Stephen Mear, credited with the musical staging here, Matthew Scott on the music, you as director, is there a sense in which Shaffer calling Amadeus almost an opera rather than a play. Is that relevant here and to needing those?
I think absolutely. For me, it was vital. It is an opera. One of the challenges, when we get back to this space, opera isn't often done in a thrust space. So finding a way of creating, and I won't give away too big a secret, but these chandeliers, which do what happens at the Met at the beginning of the show and rise. We wanted to work very hard at how we gave the whole piece the sense of opera, and of course the music does that. Our staging has to do it. How Simon delivered the set has to do it, and the costumes. You know, the richness of the costumes. We've got an extraordinary costume designer at Fattini working on this as well. We don't often have a separate costume designer, but because of this, all the elements like an opera are huge. And we don't have an opera house's resources, but we need to give an impression of that. So all these people were working with me to try and give that flavour.
Well, and that is interesting again because of the mixture of freedom and almost prescription in what Shaffer has written about how he feels the play should be staged. And he said that Amadeus can and should be played in a variety of settings, but costumes and objects were sumptuously of the period at the National and should always be so. So
it felt, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there is a version where you don't do that, but it would feel perverse, and certainly it never crossed my mind to not do that. I think some plays, you can, and I'm sure someday somebody will, but it would be hard to know, given it's so rooted in its period, how it would necessarily benefit you.
And that notion of period is so linked to the register of the language, the idiom. And just a very, very quick example, this is Salieri on composing for the aristocracy and the military. We gave them processions for their strutting, serenades for their rutting, high horns for their hunting, and drums for their wars. This in one of his many direct addresses. So can you characterize that language, how you feel it, the texture of it, and what it's like to work with it?
Well, that again, it's one of the reasons Shaffer's plays work in a theatre like this, that the language is heightened, it's lyrical, and of course the direct address is very, very, very powerful. We find these days that a play like Chekhov, which is by Chekhov, where you're sort of stripping down and looking at what's going on in here, in particularly as acting styles have moved on, get harder and harder to do in spaces like this, where you have to talk to a very large number of people. A play like this allows Salieri directly to do it, but also, even in its construction with Mozart, there's moments where, because Salieri is shining the light on 2 minutes of a day, it can be heightened enough and bright enough and shared enough with the audience that it comes alive in a space like this. It's a very interesting thing, and some playwrights have that. Shaw, with his big ideas and his politics and his rich, verbose language, sits very well in a space like this, as does Shakespeare. There are many writers who it's much harder. And so, no, it's been a joy working with that language. And of course, he gives it's not period language, but it gives a great flavour of it. And like any great writer, he's allowed, I think, Salieri's music and Mozart's music to slightly influence the way they use language.
Mm-hmm. And again, there's a Chichester historical link because of the narrator device in Royal Hunt of the Sun, and how old Martin, looking back on his adventures with Pizarro. But I think here you have the beautiful point that he's the narrator and protagonist.
Yes.
So that combination is there.
No, it's very powerful for an audience. It also means you get such a lot of information. Narration can feel very old-fashioned, weirdly, but it was also one of the great strengths of the first play I did here when I arrived, Nicholas Nickleby. The narration wasn't done by one person, but the idea of telling a lot of information to an audience, it does get, instead of 25 minutes of exposition, you're told everything very, very, very quickly. This is particularly brilliant because you see it from the perspective of an old man. You get the narration from 2 points of view, even though it's from from one character, and that's very, that's very theatrically exciting.
And with Mozart's language, one of the things that drew Shaffer and inspired him to write the play was looking at Mozart's letters and seeing that they had a lot of scatological dirty talk. And this famously was what so offended Mrs. Thatcher when she saw Amadeus at the National in 1980. And that contrast for Shaffer was extraordinary and enticing. So how do you approach that, you and Joshua Maguire, that aspect of his character?
Well, we made it's in the text and it is in his letters. He did love that kind of scatological humour. There's another, actually Matthew Scott told me this. Apparently, after Margaret Thatcher said to Peter Hall, "I'm sure Mozart wasn't like that," Peter Hall sent the letters to 10 Downing Street, and apparently they got sent back with virtually saying, "I don't believe it," even with the evidence there. So and the language is quite, in a couple of places, it's quite strong. What we did particularly now is there are several versions of the script. Peter has adjusted it over the years, and in different versions. And one particular scene, Mozart is ruder than he is in others, and so we decided we very much wanted to take the most extreme of those versions, partly because it's accurate, given the balance between it, and also in terms of understanding how the rest of the court and the world responded to him and why they particularly in Shaffer's play, they reject him not because he isn't gifted, but because he's a pain in the neck on a lot of levels, and so to make that as dramatic as possible, we chose the arguably most florid scenes that Shaffer had given us.
So we've talked about the importance of the narration and the asides, and therefore the importance, more than some plays, of the audience. And you've got your 4th preview tonight. So I'm very interested in how you and Rupert Everett, the rest of the cast, are responding now that you're no longer, as it were, preparing in a vacuum.
We learn with any play from the audience. With this, that for Rupert, and particularly with its structure, he has 8 minutes at the beginning where he talks to you, and then he probably spends another hour of the evening or 45 minutes. Every day we learn more about how to present it, and also stylistically the way to tell people. And I know we've learned a lot about what people find funny, what shocks them, and I think just and it's not something I've had to work, just watching Rupert over the 3 previews we've had, direct address and asides are pretty different. It's not as easy as a proscenium to do it here. So you watch him going, actually, I'm going to talk to all of you here, I'm going to talk to this block here, I'm going to talk to you watch him craft how he's going to talk to the audience and what he's going to tell them, and it's changed immensely over those 3. I mean, one of the things I think that the audience, and it's interesting, it's linked to the music. Of course, some people have said, "Oh, we want more music," and it has affected a couple of choices we've made. We've allowed a little more music in, and it's not so much different pieces. It's about allowing a few moments where the audience listen to the music without dialogue, and those choices. We've been changing those as we go. The other thing is just how technically we deliver these asides, because there's a lot of times when there's an aside to the audience and the rest of the characters freeze, and just on a very basic level, how you light that to tell the story and make it fluid, and where we place the focus. Our lighting designer will tell you it's turned into a musical, because it's all about picking up individual. There's hundreds and hundreds of cues that you probably won't notice, because it's all about. And at this point, we need to look at Salieri, who's talking to you. At this point, we need to look at Mozart, who's talking to him. At this point, and so it focuses what you're doing with any show. But this is so fast and furious in terms of the number of events it presents. It's given us quite a challenge, and we've learned a lot from that engagement with the audience about where the focus needs to be.
And in your managing of your time and the time available for the technical and the acting side of things, just talk us through today between what time you got here and who you've seen and what you've discussed with them before up until this point.
It's been a fairly busy day. 12:30 was we started with the actors, and we did really exciting. You know, we spent half an hour looking at how we put coats on and off. Rupert, you know, the cutting edge of the glamour of theatre. Like, Rupert has a couple of coat changes, and they all happen while he's talking, while there's a million things going on. So we just spent some time looking at all of that. I won't tell you one of the things we did because it gives something away. We went through about a quarter of the play, tightening up some staging, some lighting. We did
on here.
We were on here all today. Normally I'd do a note session with the full company because we had so much to get through. I didn't. I caught people as I went around with individual notes, and then we finished at 5 o'clock, and the technical team are busy setting up back there, ready for the performance tonight.
And we'll be busy again shortly after past, which gives us time now, ladies and gentlemen, for you to ask Jonathan questions about Amadeus. So please raise a hand. You're not mic'd, so I may repeat back the questions, but please project in your best actor's voice. So, yes.
You spoke about escaping the shadow of Schofield. What about escaping the shadow of the film?
Escaping the shadow of Schofield and the shadow of the film.
The film's quite different because there isn't by any means for Salieri the same relationship with the audience. It's a slightly different conceit, and you know the 8 minutes that Schofield and Rupert spend with the audience at the beginning is whittled down to possibly a minute in the 2 minutes. It's condensed. There's also some completely different conceits. The moment where Mozart is dying and writing his Requiem. In the film, Salieri's there with him, finishing off writing it for him, which doesn't happen in the play. So, I mean, it's different enough that in a weird way, it was less in my mind. Of course, what the film has done is made it even more popular as a thing for an audience. I think also a lot of us didn't watch the film. I mean, we'd all seen it a long time ago. We didn't really look at it coming into it. And also, it's American. I mean,
very American.
That's the other thing. And it sort of works for Mozart. I mean, apparently Tom Hulse, who played Mozart's, as we might have, based it a bit on Russell Brand, at the time it was John McEnroe. Those temper tantrums that Tom Hulse always said, well, I sort of saw John McEnroe and thought maybe that's Mozart. But the American thing was very much part of it. Even Simon Callow, who, bless him, received the phone call from the director Milos Forman saying, I'd love you to be in my movie, but I'd love you to play Chichester. Now, Chichester is an actor who, and again, this is where the film is wonderful, but it vastly differs. The film Chichester is mentioned about commissioning the magic flute here. In the film, Chichester is a huge character. I mean, it's a much bigger character than Simon Callow must have thought when he got the phone call. There's whole sequences in the music hall of the magic flute and pastiches of Mozart. He becomes so it's a very different thing. I mean, it would be fascinating to create a play out of the film, but it would be a completely different script, I think.
Yes.
Did the two lead actors just jump out at you to cast as these
did the two lead actors jump out for the cast?
Well, I wouldn't. Yes, I wouldn't have been doing Amadeus if it hadn't been for Rupert. What was wonderful about Mozart and Constanza was I absolutely knew when I met them that they were the people I wanted. There was sort of nobody else who I'd be happy with, so I was very lucky that they both wanted to do it.
Yes, I understand from what you said, the relationship between the dialogue and the music was already, as it were, formed by the sort of relationship between Shaffer and Hall.
Yeah.
And this, as it were, progresses systematically between the two characters as the play evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the fundamental relationship between the music and the text and the characters and how it's used has been determined, and we, because it's so wonderfully done, haven't messed with it very much. I mean, I think that's always the delicate... I remember, funnily enough, going back to Nicholas Nickleby, I remember thinking when we started on doing it there'd been music done, and music was quite an important part of Nicholas Nickleby, but Stephen Oliver had written the most wonderful music. However, in my "we need to reinvent this," I went, maybe we should get somebody else to do the music, and I thought about it. I asked a couple of people who said that, and then again with Matthew Scott, we went, no, we should do this, the original Stephen Oliver. I've never been so grateful that I made that choice, because the interweaving of that music and that script was part of Nickleby's, I'm convinced, was part of Nickleby's success. And I'm absolutely convinced that part of Amadeus's success are the decisions that were made on how the music was used, and how it wasn't used too much, but was an important part of it. And so slightly, you have to always make this decision with anything you revive. What do you mess with at your peril? And you know, and Rupert and I, and funnily enough, we've ended up with some decisions perhaps that aren't as radical as we thought we might start with, about some of the ways we've approached. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes you sit down and go, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that, and then you go, actually, maybe the way they did it had some merit, or the other way. But for me, that relationship that was found and the pieces that were chosen were just sublime. So we, wanted to keep that.
And it's very interesting that both of those, Nickleby and Amadeus, are so rooted in a particular time and place, whether there's a link in there.
Well, I think they're also rooted in a time and place where the British funding system, and one was created at the National in Chichester and one was created at the RSC, allowed large companies to come together to do ambitious work with great, it comes from an era that has not completely long gone, but the time that was, Nickleby, that company worked and worked and worked, they improvised, it was a huge process, and I don't imagine Amadeus was not, I've never asked Matthew how long it took to rehearse the first time, but it came from a system where artists were given the ability to both fail, but enough money, time and resource to create, works like this. So it's very interesting that these two shows came from that period, because you wouldn't, I don't know, Wolf Hall, the RSC's just done it again with Wolf Hall, a big, ambitious, the National, but, we're in another, actually theatre is having another moment. There's been a period, particularly the dark days of the late 80s, early 90s, where, I remember you were lucky if you could put a play with 10 actors on in a big theatre in a regional, in the region. So it's changed, but
yes.
Are you working with pre-recorded music or live music, or a combination?
Pre-recorded music or live?
We're working with pre-recorded music for the very simple reason that to get the sound of Mozart's music, if we'd put a band together of 12, it would have sounded good, but it certainly wouldn't sound as good as some of those great recordings. And I think you'd wonder why you didn't have a full symphony orchestra doing some of those things. So that was a simple decision.
Yes. What's the difference for Jonathan in directing on this stage now as opposed to before the redevelopment?
They're mainly practical. The fundamental relationship between the audience and the stage isn't different. Actually, the very exciting thing is, given it's a thrust space, this is a slightly odd as thrust spaces go, because there are rather too many people in front. However, because we've got the seats in the balcony that were lost over a decade ago are now back, we've got 100 more seats, a bigger proportion of the audience around the side, which I think is a good thing. So you can be a bit braver about going, actually, I've got to turn my back on this side, I've got to look at that side. That's exciting. There's some practical things to do with the time it takes to get from going down a vom to getting up. It's all different. So we had to get used to some new rhythms there. And the great joy is, this set that you can see goes back further than you could ever have gone. Where that curved wall and those back doors are sitting now were steps up onto the stage. So we've got more space. The stage shape you can see here, you can see on the floor where the original hexagon is. We couldn't have even done this stage shape because the original structure of the original hexagon was, couldn't be got rid of. Whereas we've now, this can go and we can make it any shape. And so this rather beautiful, I think it looks like a musical instrument, floor is the first. So there's lots of benefits, but it's not fundamentally different in terms of the stagecraft.
Maybe one final question before we let stage management come in. Yes, sir. How far were you able to implement your creative vision to Amadeus?
You never know that answer. You always have, and it sometimes happens and it sometimes doesn't, and this is completely subjective. You have a thing in your head about how a show might feel, might look, might smell. Some shows you get very close to what you first thought, and some you don't, and it's a combination of the actors, the design, the audience's response. This isn't far, but maybe that's because this is a revival. There's the films in our head, a version of the plays in our head. Its world is quite defined. So, I think we've done pretty much what we wanted with it, which is a good thing. There are times you start on a show and you think you're going to do this, and you discover something completely different, or you discover that the thing you had doesn't marry with the play very well. Or doesn't serve it. And I'm afraid that, when that happens, when you've ended up with a set and a group of acts that you're very excited about because you've got, and then you discover during it that you've got it wrong, it's too late.
Alas, there's no more time for questions this evening. However, there are many more opportunities to explore Peter Shaffer's work here at Chichester in this celebration. The next 3 weekends, in fact. If you go online, if you go to the box office, you can get the full details of the programme of events exploring Peter Shaffer's work. Albert Finney is involved, Simon Callow, Patrick Stewart. I'm giving a talk on the 26th about Shaffer's National Theatre in Chichester plays. So if you go online or to the box office, you can find out more about these events. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and our thanks to Jonathan Church.